Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. The afternoon sun slanted through the leaves of my sister Sarah's giant oak tree, dappling the porch swing where I sat with a half-finished glass of iced tea. Visiting Sarah was always a balm to my soul, especially lately. The quiet suburban street, the scent of freshly cut grass, the gentle rhythm of her life. It was a world away from the noise and hurried pace I'd left behind. My divorce was final just 6 months prior, and while I was putting on a brave face, truth was, I felt a bit adrift, like a boat cut loose from its moorings. Sarah, bless her heart, knew exactly when to fuss and when to just let me be. Today was a let me be day, and I was grateful for the solitude, watching the world go by from her wicker throne. That's when I first saw him. He came around the side of the neat, blue house next door, whistling a tune I couldn't quite place. He carried a pair of dusty gardening gloves and a small trowel. He wasn't classically handsome in the way movie stars are, but there was something solid and kind about his face, etched with lines that spoke of laughter and maybe a few worries too. He looked up, saw me sitting there, and his whistling trailed off. He offered a small, neighborly wave. I waved back a little self-consciously. Sarah had mentioned her neighbor, David, a widower who mostly kept to himself, but was always pleasant. He's a good sort, she'd said. Lost his wife a few years back. Cancer? He throws himself into his garden. He hesitated for a moment at the edge of his lawn, then seemed to make a decision. He walked purposefully across the grass that separated their properties, stopping at the foot of Sarah's porch steps. "Afternoon," he said. His voice was deeper than I expected, warm, with a slight roughness around the edges. "You must be Sarah's sister. Clara, right?" I nodded, surprised he knew my name. "That's me. And you're David." He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, which were a surprising shade of hazel green, like moss after a rain. "Guilty as charged? Sarah talks about you." He gestured vaguely with the trowel, said you were visiting for a bit. "Just for the week," I replied, tucking a stray strand of hair behind my ear, trying to recharge the batteries. "This is a good place for it," he agreed, glancing around Sarah's peaceful yard. "Quiet. Good neighbors?" There was a slight emphasis on the last words, and I wondered if he meant himself or the neighborhood in general. We fell into a comfortable silence for a moment, the kind that doesn't feel awkward, just restful. The air hummed with the sound of distant lawnmowers and the buzz of bees in Sarah's overflowing flower beds. David leaned against the porch railing, crossing his arms. He wasn't imposing, just present. "Anything interesting blooming over here?" he asked, nodding towards a particularly vibrant patch of peonies. "Sarah's got the magic touch." "She does," I agreed. "Mine always seem to sulk, no matter what I do." He chuckled, a low, pleasant sound. "They can be temperamental, like people, sometimes." He looked directly at me then, and there was an understanding in his gaze that felt unexpectedly intimate. It wasn't flirtatious, not exactly, but it was seeing, like he wasn't just looking at Sarah's sister on the porch, but at me. It flustered me slightly. I took a sip of my tea, the ice cubes clinking against the glass. "So," I said, searching for something neutral, "gardening keeps you busy?" He nodded, his gaze drifting towards his own meticulous flower beds bordering the fence. "It does. Gets me out of my head. Something about digging in the dirt, watching things grow. It grounds you." I understood that feeling completely. My own small apartment balcony garden was my sanctuary, though nowhere near as impressive as his or Sarah's. "I get that," I murmured. "There's a satisfaction in nurturing something." He looked back at me, that thoughtful expression returning. "Exactly. You put something in, you care for it, and most times you get something beautiful back. Not always, but often enough. Was he just talking about flowers? It felt like more. Like he was sharing a small piece of his philosophy, his way of coping. Just then, Sarah's screen door creaked open, and she bustled out, wiping her hands on her apron. "David, I thought I heard voices. Stealing my sister already?" she teased, smiling warmly at him. "Just saying hello," David replied easily, straightening up from the railing. "Admiring your peonies." "Oh, they're putting on a show this year, aren't they?" Sarah beamed. "Clara, you should see David's roses. They're prize winners, truly." David waved a dismissive hand, a faint blush creeping up his neck. "Sarah exaggerates." "I do not," Sarah insisted. "Listen, I was just about to put the kettle on again. David, fancy a proper cup of tea? Not this iced stuff Clara's nursing." He glanced at me, then back at Sarah. "Well, I wouldn't want to intrude." "Nonsense," Sarah declared, holding the door open wider. "Come on in. Clara needs the company, even if she won't admit it." I shot Sarah a look, half annoyed, half amused, but David just chuckled again. "All right then," he said, wiping his boots carefully on the mat before stepping inside. "Lead the way." As I followed them into the cool dimness of Sarah's kitchen, I felt a strange little flutter in my chest. It wasn't just the neighbor stopping by. It felt like the start of something unexpected, a subtle shift in the quiet afternoon air. The kitchen was cozy, filled with the scent of cinnamon from whatever Sarah had been baking earlier. David sat at the small wooden table, looking perfectly at home, while Sarah bustled around getting mugs and fetching the tea caddy. I took the seat opposite him, feeling strangely shy, like a teenager again. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't let on. He was asking Sarah about her prize-winning zucchini from last year's county fair, and she launched into the story with gusto. I listened, watching him. He was a good listener, attentive, asking questions in the right places, his gaze never leaving Sarah's face as she spoke. It was nice to see. So many people nowadays seem to just wait for their turn to talk. When Sarah paused to pour the boiling water over the tea bags, David turned his attention back to me. "So, Clara," he began, his tone casual, "Sarah mentioned you work in, is it library archiving?" I was surprised again. Sarah must have been talking about me more than I realized. "That's right," I confirmed, "preserving old documents, photographs, local history stuff. It's quiet work, but fascinating." "I can imagine," he said, leaning forward slightly, his interest seeming genuine. "Holding a piece of the past in your hands must feel significant." "It does," I admitted. "Sometimes you find these little forgotten stories tucked away in letters or diaries. Ordinary people living extraordinary lives, you know?" "I do know," he said, his voice softening. "My wife, Mary, she used to keep diaries, pages and pages. After she passed, I found them. Took me a year before I could bring myself to read them." He paused, looking down at his hands resting on the table. They were strong hands, capable, with soil still ingrained around the nails despite his earlier attempt to wipe them. When I finally did, it was like getting to know her all over again. Little things she thought, worries she never shared, moments of joy I'd forgotten. It was a gift. The vulnerability in his voice resonated deep within me. Sharing something like that with a near stranger wasn't typical, but it didn't feel forced or uncomfortable. It felt honest. Sarah placed steaming mugs in front of us, her movements quiet, sensing the shift in conversation. "That sounds beautiful, David," she said gently. He looked up, offering a small, grateful smile. "It was hard, but beautiful. He turned back to me. So, I understand the fascination with old stories. They're important. They remind us who we are, where we came from. We talked then, easily, comfortably, about books we'd read, places we'd traveled or dreamt of traveling to. He'd spent time in the Navy years ago, seen parts of the world I'd only read about. I talked about my work, the peculiar satisfaction of carefully piecing together a fragmented letter or identifying faces in a century-old photograph. Sarah mostly listened, sipping her tea, occasionally adding a comment or anecdote, but largely letting the conversation flow between David and me. It struck me how different this felt from the conversations I'd grown used to. There were no pretenses, no attempts to impress. It was just connection, discovering shared interests, understanding different perspectives. He had a dry sense of humor that surfaced unexpectedly, making me laugh out loud more than once. He asked about my life, not invasively, but with genuine curiosity. I found myself telling him about the city, about feeling disconnected sometimes, about the strange sense of being untethered since the divorce, things I hadn't even fully articulated to Sarah. He listened patiently, his hazel eyes thoughtful. "Change is hard," he said quietly after I trailed off. "Feels like the ground shifting under your feet. But sometimes it shifts you onto more solid ground. Takes time to realize it, though." His words, simple as they were, landed like anchors. He wasn't offering platitudes or easy answers. He was just acknowledging the truth of it, sharing a perspective forged from his own experience. Outside, the shadows were beginning to lengthen. The golden afternoon light turned richer, warmer. Sarah got up to clear the mugs. "Well," David said, pushing his chair back slightly, "I should probably let you ladies get on with your evening. Thank you for the tea, Sarah. And Clara," he looked at me, "it was really nice talking to you." "You too, David," I said, and I meant it. There was a sincerity in the exchange that felt rare. As Sarah walked him to the door, I stayed at the table, tracing the rim of my empty mug. I felt lighter. The conversation hadn't solved anything, hadn't magically erased the uncertainties in my life, but it had opened a window. It had reminded me that connection could happen unexpectedly, quietly, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. When Sarah came back, she had a knowing little smile on her face. "He's nice, isn't he?" she asked, stacking the mugs in the sink. "Yes," I agreed, meeting her gaze. "He really is." Nothing more needed to be said. The quiet understanding hung in the air, comfortable and warm, like the lingering scent of cinnamon. The next few days fell into a pleasant rhythm. I helped Sarah in her garden, we visited local antique shops, and I spent quiet hours reading on the porch. David was a regular presence next door, often puttering in his yard. We'd exchange waves, sometimes chat briefly over the fence about the weather or the progress of his roses, which were indeed spectacular. Each brief interaction felt easy, natural. There was no awkwardness, just a growing sense of familiarity. One evening, Sarah had a meeting for her book club, leaving me on my own. I made a simple salad for dinner and settled back onto the porch swing as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and rose. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of night-blooming jasmine from somewhere down the street. I saw David come out onto his own porch, holding a glass of what looked like whiskey. He saw me, hesitated only a second, then ambled over, much like he had the first day. "Evening, Clara," he said, stopping at the steps again. "Mind if I join you for a bit? Quiet night over here." "Not at all," I smiled, gesturing to the wicker armchair opposite the swing. "Please." He sat down, stretching his legs out. We sat in silence for a while, watching the first stars prick the darkening sky. It was peaceful, not the tense silence of strangers, but the companionable quiet of people comfortable in each other's presence. "Sarah off solving the world's problems with her book club?" he asked eventually, a smile in his voice. I chuckled, something like that. "Tonight, it's a historical novel, so maybe just solving the past's problems." "Ah, the past," he mused, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Easier to solve than the present, usually." "Isn't that the truth?" I agreed softly. He took a slow sip of his drink. "You know, Clara," he said, his voice thoughtful, "what you were saying the other day about feeling untethered, I felt that way for a long time after Mary died. Like I was just drifting. Work, home, sleep, repeat. The garden helped, like I said, gave me a focus." He paused, looking out towards the streetlights flickering on. "But connection, that's different. Takes more than just routine." I nodded, understanding implicitly. Routine could keep you busy, keep you functioning, but it couldn't fill the hollow spaces. "It's hard to find, sometimes," I admitted, "or maybe hard to let yourself find." He turned his gaze towards me, his expression serious, but kind. "Maybe it finds you when you least expect it, or when you finally stop bracing yourself against it." His words hung in the air. It felt like we were talking about more than just general connection. It felt personal. My heart gave a little thump against my ribs. Was he? No, I told myself. He's just being kind, philosophical, a widower sharing his thoughts with his sister's divorced neighbor. Don't read too much into it. But still, there was an intensity in the quiet moment, a shared understanding that transcended polite conversation. He must have sensed my slight discomfort because he shifted slightly, his tone becoming lighter. "Speaking of finding things," he said, "I was clearing out a corner of my garage today. Found an old box of Mary's, full of sheet music. She played the piano beautifully." "Oh, wow," I said. "Does the piano still?" "Oh, yeah," he nodded. "It's in the living room. Big old upright. Haven't touched it much since, well, but looking at that music today," he trailed off. "Did you ever play?" I asked. He shook his head. "Nah, tinnier, me, but I loved listening to her." He looked at me again. "Do you play, Clara?" A warmth spread through me. "I used to," I admitted, "a long time ago. My grandmother taught me. Nothing fancy, just simple tunes." An idea sparked in his eyes. "Listen, this might be forward, but would you want to see it? The music? Maybe even play something? The piano could probably use waking up." My breath caught. Go into his house. Alone? It felt significant, but his invitation was so genuine, so devoid of any pressure, just a simple, almost shy request. And the thought of touching piano keys again after so long, it was strangely appealing. I'm probably terribly rusty," I stammered, feeling that teenage shyness again. "Doesn't matter," he said gently. "Tin ear, remember? Besides," he gave a small smile, "it's just an old piano sitting in the dark. Might like the company." I looked at his earnest face, the kindness in his eyes. What harm could there be? It wasn't a proposition. It felt like an offering, a sharing of something precious. "Okay, David," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'd like that." He stood up, offering me his hand to help me off the low swing. His hand was warm, strong, callous from gardening. The simple contact sent a surprising jolt through me, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fading summer evening. We walked across the lawn, the grass cool and damp beneath my sandals, towards the soft light spilling from his living room window. His house felt like him, solid, comfortable, unpretentious. Books lined shelves. Photos sat on the mantelpiece. A smiling woman with kind eyes, presumably Mary, alongside pictures of what looked like children and grandchildren. It felt like a home filled with memories, lived in and loved. The piano, a dark wood upright, dominated one wall of the living room. It looked well cared for, polished, but silent. David led me over to it, opening a worn cardboard box, resting on a nearby chair. "Here it is," he said softly. The box was filled with sheet music, yellowed with age, classical pieces, old standards, handwritten scores. It was a tangible piece of his wife's life, her passion. I reached in almost reverently, lifting out a brittle piece of music, Chopin, something I hadn't attempted since I was a girl. "She loved Chopin," David murmured, watching me, said his music held all the emotions you couldn't put into words. I carefully opened the lid covering the piano keys. They were ivory, smooth and cool, beneath my hesitant fingers. It had been years, more than I cared to count. Sitting down on the worn bench felt both strange and incredibly familiar. David stood nearby, not crowding me, just present. "No pressure," he said quietly. "Just if you feel like it." I took a deep breath. My fingers hovered over the keys. What if I couldn't remember anything? What if I just made horrible, clunky noises? Then I thought of what David had said about the piano liking the company. I thought about Mary pouring her emotions into this instrument. I thought about the unexpected connection I felt sitting here in this quiet house with this kind man. My fingers found a simple chord, then another, tentative at first, like finding my footing on uneven ground. I started with something easy, a lullaby my grandmother had taught me. The notes filled the quiet room, a little hesitant, a little uneven, but clear. The piano had a beautiful tone, rich and mellow. As I played, the initial stiffness in my fingers began to ease. The melody flowed more smoothly. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it felt good, like stretching a muscle I hadn't used in far too long. I glanced up at David. He was leaning against the doorframe, his eyes closed, a soft, almost wistful expression on his face. He wasn't judging my rusty playing. He was just listening, remembering. Emboldened, I tried something else, a simple piece I recalled from years ago. The music seemed to fill the space between us, weaving a thread of shared experience. It wasn't about performance. It was about the act itself, the shared vulnerability, the resurrection of something beautiful from silence. When the last note faded, the silence that followed felt different, charged somehow, full. David opened his eyes. They looked darker in the lamplight, deeper. "Thank you, Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. That was... Mary would have loved that. Hearing her name spoken with such tenderness didn't feel intrusive. It felt like I'd been allowed into a sacred space, offered a glimpse into the love he still carried. I felt tears prickle behind my own eyes, for his loss, for the beauty of the music, for the unexpected intimacy of the moment. "She must have been wonderful," I whispered. He nodded, swallowing. "She was..." He walked slowly over to the piano bench and, after a moment's hesitation, sat down beside me. Not too close, maintaining a respectful distance, but near enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. We didn't speak for a long moment. We just sat there, side by side, looking at the silent keys, surrounded by the lingering resonance of the music and the weight of unspoken emotions. Then, he slowly reached out, not to touch me, but to gently rest his hand flat on the polished wood of the piano, near mine. His hand looked so strong, so capable, yet there was a tremor in it, "It's been quiet in this house for a long time," he said, his voice low and rough. "Too quiet." He turned his head, looking directly at me. His gaze was intense, searching, but also incredibly gentle. There was no pretense left, no polite, neighborly conversation. Just two people, sitting in the quiet glow of a lamp, sharing a moment of profound, unexpected connection. My breath hitched. This was it, the unexpected experience. Not a dramatic event, but a quiet unfolding, a deep emotional resonance that felt more significant than any grand gesture. It was the trust he showed in sharing his grief, his memories, his home. It was the vulnerability in his eyes, mirroring the vulnerability I felt in my own heart. It was the shared silence, heavy with understanding and the dawning realization that something important was happening between us. He didn't lean in to kiss me. He didn't make a move. He simply held my gaze, a silent question in his eyes, a shared acknowledgement of the spark that had ignited in the quiet intimacy of the room.